Today's daf is daf Samach Vav. We'll pick it up where we left off yesterday on Samach Hey Omid Beis, and we're talking about a machlokas recorded in a brisa between the Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar. And the machlokas revolves around a case where in a chatas ha'of he went ahead and he did havdalah. And the Gemara is going to offer a number of different interpretations of that machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and the Tanakama. So let's just review the first two approaches, which we did yesterday, and those are Rav Chizda and Rava. According to Rav Chizda, the machlokes is about mitzui chatos ha'of, and the Tanakama holds that mitzui in chatas ha'of is ma'akev. It's absolutely critical, which means that there are two basic essential avodos in chatas ha'of. One is malika, and the second is mitzui. Therefore, according to the Tanakama, if in a chatas ha'of he went ahead and he imitated a a a chatas ha'of, I'm sorry, an olas ha'of, therefore it's going to be possible. He went ahead and he did the mitzui that would be appropriate for an olas ha'of, and he did it in a chatas ha'of. And Rabbi Elazar holds no. Rabbi Elazar holds that mitzui is not ma'akiv in a chatas ha'of. Anyway, then we went ahead and we suggested a second approach to this machlokes. That was that of Rava, about shehiyah. If he took a pause between the first siman and the second siman in the case of an olas ha'of, and the machlokes here between the Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar is what happens. He went ahead and he did a shehiyah in the chatas ha'of. The truth is that in a chatas ha'of, almost by definition, there's going to be shehiyah, because after he cuts the first siman with malika, then he has to clear out the basar, and he can't go on to the second siman immediately. So shehiyah is almost built in to a procedure for a chatas ha'of. Now, according to the Chachamim, shehiyah, with regard to the second siman in olas ha'of, does not passel the oaf. And the lumdus here is very fascinating, because even though the Torah says in olas ha'of yavdil, which means he has to cut both simanim in order to sever the head from the body, but nevertheless, as far as the law of malika is concerned, one siman would be enough, because an oaf cannot survive after one siman was cut. So the purpose of cutting the second siman is fundamentally different than that of the first siman. The first siman is really the laws of malika. The second siman that he needs in the malika is not because of malika, but rather because of a separate, shall we call it a kiyum, of havdalah. Anyway, the bottom line is that according to the Tanakama, shehiyah and a chatas ha'of does not passel the chata. I'm sorry. Let me go over this one more time. Shehiyah in the olas ha'of, I meant to say. Then we'll get to the chatas ha'of. And the olas ha'of does not passel, because, as we said, it's a different halacha entirely when he shechts the second siman. It's not part of the ma'aseh shchita, which is here ma'aseh malika. Oh, so now, since in the case of shehiyah on the second siman and chatas ha'of, it does not invalidate the carbon. Therefore, if he does shehiyah in a chatas ha'of, that's a real problem, because then the procedure that he's implementing for the chat sof is identical to that which he implements in olas ha'of. And whenever the procedure of the chat ha'of imitates and repeats the procedure for the olas ha'of, then the chat ha'of is psula. Rabbi Loz, on the other hand, holds that even though the second simon in Olas Ha'of is for the purpose of Avdullah, but nevertheless it becomes part of the Maisa Malika, and therefore if there was Shahir between the first simon and the second simon in Olas Ha'of, it passes it, and therefore Rabbi Loza would hold that in the case of Chatas Ha'of, if he does Shahir, then the carbon will be kosher because he's not imitating the procedure of the Olasov, because in the case of the Olasov, there is no Shahir. Shahir would invalidate the carbon. So now that's what we covered yesterday. What we want to cover today is a third approach to the Machlokas Rebbe Lazar and the Tanna Kama, and that's the approach of Abaye. So let's see if we can find the place. It's on Daf Samachei Amid Beis. And it's Abaye Omar, which I would say is it's a little bit more than halfway down the Amud. The first word in that line is Bi'alma. Let's see if you can find Omar Abaye. Rov basar mi'akev ikabenayu. The question is about Rov basar. Now, let's just understand that in the case of Chatas Ha'of, he needs not only to do Malika, but he also has to cut around the first simon and then the second simon, cut out the basar. He's got to remove that basar with a knife. And the question is whether or not, in the case of Chatas Ha'of, this requirement of rov basar, which everybody agrees lechatchila you have to do, you have to cut out the rov basar, but is it mi'akev? Is it essential? And that's going to be the subject of the machlokas between Rabbi Lazar and the Chacham, according to Abaye. So for this, we have to understand that according to Abaye, as opposed to Rava, everybody agrees, kuliyamalo pligi, that Shehia in the second Simon in Olas Ha'of would passel the carbon, which was, according to Rava, the unique opinion of Rabbi Loza, but according to Abaye, even the Tanna Kama will subscribe to that opinion. The machlokas, therefore, is with regard to cutting the flesh, or shall we say the greater part, the rove of the flesh, and whether or not that is absolutely essential in the case of a Chatas Ha'of. Rabbi Loza holds it's essential, and the Tanna Kama holds it's not essential. Therefore, although the Tanna Kama agrees that if somebody cuts, in the case of an Olas Chatas, if somebody cuts the second pipe after he cuts out the greater part of the flesh, so that does not disqualify the Chatas, because by doing so, he has a Shehiyah between the first Simon and the second Simon. And now we're holding Kohen Tabai that even according to the Tanna Kama, such a Shehiyah in the case of an Olas Ha'of would be Ma'akiv, would be essential. But the Tanna Kama holds that cutting the rov basar is not essential. And therefore, when the Kohen implements Malika in the case of an Olas Ha'of, if he would skip the entire procedure of cutting the greater flesh, he would still have a carbon kosher, and the Chatas Ha'of would be kosher. Now, if he does so, by skipping that middle step between the first semen and the second semen of cutting rov basar, he goes directly to cutting the second semen of this Chatas Ha'of. That's going to be possible, because now, by not having any shehiyah between the first simon and the second simon is exactly imitating the procedure that's appropriate for the olas ha'of, and therefore it passes the chatas ha'of. Now, according to Rabbi Lazar, on the other hand, the Kohen could never skip that step of cutting rov basar because he holds that it's essential to the chatas ha'of. So if the Kohen now severs the pipe, the second pipe of the bird chatas, he's not duplicating the procedure for the old self because he's interrupting. He's interrupting between the Malika on the first Simon and the Malika on the second Simon, which Rab Lazar holds, and even the Tanakh would agree in this case, that would passel the Olas Ha'of. And we go on. Ubeplukta de Rabbi Zera of Rab Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. This machlokes, according to Abaye, about rov basa, whether it's ma'akiv or not in a chatas ha'of, is indeed a machlokes amoroim between Rabbi Zera and Rab Shmuel. Chan Omer, according to one opinion, shehiyah b'simon sheni bi'olas ha'of ika beinayu. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me correct myself. The machlokes between Abaye and Rava as to how to interpret the dispute between the Tanakh and Rabbi Lazar, and there are two approaches, that of Abaye and that of Rava, is in fact the two approaches of Reb Zera versus Reb Shmuel. Chan Omer, according to one approach, is shehiyah b'siman sheni be'olas ha'of is ika beinayu, and that's going like Rava. V'chad Omer rov basa mi'akav ika beinayu. The machlokas about rov basa, and that's Abaye. But the Gemara points out here that everybody agrees that l'chatchila, the way to do the procedure in chatas ha'of properly would be to require rov basar. The machlokas is that whether or not it's ma'akiv, it's essential or not. Michlal, says the Gemara, to be in rov basar b'tchila. B'tchila means l'chatchila. And the Gemara says in. But Tanya, I'm going to bring you a brisa to prove that everybody agrees that the normal, regular l'chatchila procedure of chatas ha'of requires rov basar, because the brisa says ketzad molkim chatas ha'of chotech shidra umafrekes below rov basar. Okay, so now we're focused on the first of the two simonim, the malika at the beginning of the stage of malika in a chatas ha'of, and he's cutting through the spinal cord and the neck bone. He doesn't cut the greater part of the flesh around the bird's neck until he gets to the second simon, shemagil veshet o lekana. The second simon would be either veshet or kana, the esophagus of the windpipe. It doesn't matter in which order he does that, but when he gets to the second of those two, and he gil veshet o lekana, chotech simon echad o rov o rubo v'rov basar imo. So he gets to the second simon, and now he has to cut most of the second simon. He doesn't have to cut the entire second simon. And in fact, we're talking about a chatas ha'of with lo yavdil. But now the brisa requires that he should cut rov basar. Ubi ola, however, in the case of a carbon olas ha'of, Ve'ashnayim or rov shnayim, he immediately does a malika on both simonim. So there's no procedure requiring cutting out the rov basar. Amru kami to Rabbi Yirmiyah. They mentioned this machlokas between Reb Zera and Reb Shmuel in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, which is also again the machlokas between Abaye and Rava. Omar, and Rabbi Yirmiyah remarked, Lo Shmiele. Now here there's a whole Masorah. Did you not hear Had the Omer of Shimba Yaakov Bishum Reb Lazar Reb Shimon Bishum Reb Lazar Reb Shimon Omer El Rebbe? So we finally get back to Rebbe, And Rebbe Omelo Rebbe Lozo Rebbe Shimon Shamati Bechatas Ha'of Shemavdilim. Unbelievable. We've been assuming all along that the Torah says V'lo Yavdil with regard to Chatas Ha'of, which means that he's not going to sever two simonim, or at least not immediately. He may cut the first simon, then do whatever he has to do, and then he'll cut the second simon fine. But whatever it is, he's not in the case of Chatsof performing Havdalah. I mean, the Mavdil is appropriate for Chatas Ha'of. And therefore, I would never entertain the idea until this statement that Rabbi Miriam brings in the name of all these different Tanoim, namely that even in Chatas Ha'of, there should be Havdalah. And that's what he calls it, Bechatas Ha'of Mavdilim. Right? If he said Olas Ha'of Mavdilim, that would be fine. But Chatas Ha'of Mavdilim, Umay Lo Yavdil. What are you going to do with the pasuk? The pasuk says Lo Yavdil, and here we start the daf for today in Sarach Lahavdil. Ein, I should say ein, not in ein. Sarach Lahavdil. The Torah is not saying that he's not allowed to be Mavdil, and that would invalidate the carbon. The Torah is saying he doesn't need Havdalah. Whereas in Olas Ha'of, there's a requirement of Havdalah. In Chatas Ha'of, it's an option. It's a prerogative. There are two alternatives. Amalei Rav Acha Brei Rav Ashi. Now we're getting into biblical exegesis, meaning when the Torah says lo something, lo X, what does the Torah mean? The Torah means you don't have to do X, or the Torah means don't do X. You're not allowed to do X. Elameata, if you're interpreting in this context of Rabbi Loza, that Rabbi Loza understands that V'lo Yavdil means he doesn't have to do Havdalah, then Gabi Bar D'chsiv V'lo Yechasenu, you'd have to interpret it to be consistent as he doesn't have to cover the bar that he dug. That doesn't make any sense. You dug the pit, you have to cover the pit. Otherwise, you'll be responsible for any damages in that pit. So the Gemara says, you know what? Your question, Rav Acha, and your comparison and your premise is not correct. Hasam came in the Chsiv Baal Habar Yishalem. The Torah immediately says that the digger of the pit has to pay damages and compensate the one who fell in for any loss he suffered. Is Ilave Hu Derami Lachasuya. It's obvious that when the Torah says Lo Yechasenu, he didn't do what he was required to do. Aval Hacha Michti Ksiv V'Hikrivu V'Krivo. With regard to the Olas Ha'of, it says V'Hikrivo. Cholak HaKosu Ben Chatas Ha'of Li Olas Ha'of. The Torah is hereby contrasting the two ofos, the Chatas Ha'of and the Olas Ha'of. And what is the thrust and the teaching here that we derive from this contrast? That the Olas Ha'of, where you cut both simonim through the malika, as opposed to the Chatas Ha'of, where you only cut one of the simonim, lo yavdil lamali. I mean, if you only have to cut one simon, so there's not going to be any Havdalah here. So why does the Torah have to add v'lo yavdil? Shma mina. Therefore, Rabbi Loza derived the conclusion that when the Torah said lo yavdil, it's einot tzarech lahavdil. He's not required to do Havdalah. So again, in v'lo yechasenu means that he's required to do kisui, and if he doesn't do kisui, he's going to suffer the consequences and pay the damages. But in the case of chatas ha'of, when it says lo yavdil, it means ein tzarech lahavdil. Tanarabanan. So 1 second. The Mishnah says mitzah dam haguf, etc., meaning the mitzah in the case of an olas ha'of, which is a critical part of the avoda of the olas ha'of, malika, and then mitzui, where he squeezes the dam onto the mizbeach, is the ikar mitzui, the Mishnah establishes, is the mitzui of the guf. So that the essential mitzui, which is critical in olas ha'of, is the mitzui of the guf, not the mitzui of the dam harosh. Tana Rabbanan ola. The pasuk says ola. This is in the beginning of Vayikra, and the Torah says ola hu ishe reach nichach lashem. And when it says ola hu, that is superfluous, because the beginning of the pasuk says we're talking about the olas oaf, the oaf ola. Is ola is coming to tell me afal pisha mitzvah dama gufalo mitzvah dama rush. He validates the carbon olas ha'of even in the absence of mitzui dam harosh, as long as he did that which was critical of mitzui dam haguf. But how do you know that? Yachol, says the Bryce, I might think mitzui dam harosh v'lo mitzui dam haguf. Maybe it's sufficient if he only does mitzui to the rush and he doesn't do mitzui tamalomer who. Right? The pasuk says, let's read it again. Ola hu. And what's the who? The who is excluding this case where he did mitzui only to the rush and he didn't do mitzui to the guf. So the Gemara asks immediately, my Talmuda, how do you know? How do you know which one? It says who, it's excluding. What's it excluding? Maybe it's excluding the case where he did mitzui of the rush. Maybe it's excluding the case where he did the rush. So Gemara says, there's a logic. And what's the logic? Mistabra, the rov domin beguf shchichi. Right, most of the blood in the body of the oaf from head to toe is in the guf, and the miut, the smaller minority volume of dam, is in the rush. So it makes sense that if the Torah is saying that one of these two, in terms of mitzvah, is absolutely critical, it would have to be the mitzvah of the guf, hadran olecha kodshe kodshe. So now we begin the seventh parak of Zevachim, Beis Hashem, and it says here the chatas ha'of shasol mata. Now, the Mishnah is going to give us a list of cases where first the chatas ha'of is possible, and then the olas ha'of is possible. The chatas ha'of is going to be possible. So wait a minute. First the Mishnah describes the ideal situation where you did everything right. You checked off all the boxes. So asol mata, right? The chatas ha'of has to be done on the second lower part of the mizbeach below the chut hasikra. And kemaisa chatos, he did all the procedures of a maisa chatos, and he did the first simon, and then he cut out the basar, and he did the second simon, and then he did the mitzui, whatever he has to do. He doesn't have to. Mitzui is not ma'akev. And l'shem chatos. And not only that, he had in mind l'shma for the purpose of chatos. So everything checks off. Kshera. I mean, the Mishnah doesn't have to tell me that. The Mishnah has to tell me kshera only as an introduction to the sefer of the Mishnah, where it tells me when it's not kshera. For example, if he does kemaisa chatos l'shem ola, so in chatos shalol l'shma passes the carbon. So therefore, if he had in mind l'shem ola, the carbon is possible. Not only that, but kemaisa ola l'shem chatos, even if he had l'shem chatos in mind, but he does kemaisa ola, he does the procedure that is appropriate for an ola, which the Gemara is going to explain what exactly the Mishnah has in mind. And kemaisa ola l'shem ola, how much more so, it goes without saying, if he did the procedure of an ola and a bird chatos. And not only that, he did lishma for the sake of an ola, which is possible. So everything is possible. Psula. Asala malo kemaisa kulam psula. Now, the phrase kemaisa kulam means that that he instead of doing the maisa kulam, and it's the normal, regular, appropriate hazah, which in 90% of the cases is lamata. He did it lamala, and we're talking about a chatas off where the hazah has to be lamata. So psula that shalom b'mkomon is possible. Okay, now the Mishnah goes on to Ola. So first of all, the perfect Ola of Shasol Mala. He did it on the top half of the Mizbech, which is what he has to do. And Kemaisa Ola. He did all the procedures that are appropriate for an Ola. And L'Shem Ola he had in mind for the purpose of Ola Kshem. And that's again an introduction to the second part of the Mishnah. But if he does Kemaisa Ola Shem Chatos, you might think that Shalol Shma, because he had in mind in this Ola for the sake of Chatos, it should pass it. No. Shalol Lishma doesn't pass the carbon, as we learned at the very beginning of Zevachim. It's just lo ol l'bayla l'shem chova, and if a kshera ubilvad shalo also l'bayla, and therefore the baylam have to bring a second olasa oaf to substitute for the first olasa oaf, because they weren't yotze their chiyuv. Kemaisa chatos. Or what happens if instead of implementing the procedure that's appropriate for an olas oaf, he imitated a chatas oaf, that's going to pass the carbon, or l'shem ola, meaning even though he had in mind the right lishma, but he did the maisa chatos, or kamaisa chatos shem chatos, now he has two strikes against him, right? It goes without saying that if he, number one, did the procedure of a chatos instead of that of an ola, and he had in mind l'shem chatos instead of l'shem ola psula, asola mato kemaisa kulam psula. If he followed the normal regular procedure and he did a hazas hadam mitzvah hadam on the bottom half of the mizbech when he should have done on the top, it's shalom b'mkomon that passes the carbon.